Oh, well, hi, my name is Greg and you're watching Chapter 19 within a series of YouTube videos that I have been producing on my 1949 P3 Rover Restoration story. In this chapter, I'm going to cover work that I've done in restoring the car's interior timber trim. Now, Rovers of this era have some particularly nice interior timber trim, but in the case of my car, the trim was looking decidedly the worse for wear after 70 odd years. I had the usual problem with the usual wear and tear, but I also had some problems with wood rot in one corner of the dash. So I'll go through the work that I did, which will include repairs to the timber, stripping back the old finish, sanding, staining, and then finally refinishing with polyurethane. I'll also cover a good luck story that I had with respect to one piece of the car's interior timber trim. But before getting on with this chapter, I'll just mention one other thing. So in an effort at least to improve the overall quality of my YouTube videos, I've begun shooting in 4K, so I'm hoping that'll make a difference to the quality. Let me know in the comments if you will. But now, without any further introduction, let's get on with Chapter 19. These photos were taken in the early days of my restoration project, and as you can see, some of the timber work wasn't in great shape, particularly one corner of the dash. So what appears to have happened is that there was a water leak in that corner of the windscreen, which caused the dash to remain damp for lengthy periods of time in that corner, which in turn provided a great environment for wood rot to grow. So whilst I had my car in for rust and body repair and painting, I also made use of a specialist woodworker that they had at that facility. So here you can see some repair that they completed for me on that left-hand section of the upper part of the dash. I also had them cut a new plywood section of the dash for me. So when I got the car back home, I salvaged these little blocks that screw into the back of the dash to put onto my new section of plywood. So after transferring these little blocks to the new section of ply, the blocks were mainly about sort of supports for the glove boxes. I set about staining the plywood section of the dash and then began the refinishing process. So this is the dash after about 5 coats of polyurethane finish. Whilst I was doing that, I also had the instruments refurbished. I'll have to cover the work on the instruments in another chapter because there is a fair bit to cover. Now I'm just going to have a look at the original plywood flat section of the dash here. As you can see, it's got that damage in the corner that I've shown before. And there's also some damage or some hacking that's happened here where somebody's, I guess, fitted a radio at some point. With this dash, I'd always been working on the assumption that it was veneered, but I'm not so sure that is the case actually. As I look at this, I'm pretty sure what it actually is just a good quality piece of plywood that's been stained to match the colour of the solid pieces of timber. So in a way, that's what I've tried to reproduce really. Okay, we've seen the timber trim as it was when I started this restoration project. So now we're sitting in the car looking at what I'd describe as the first major stage of timber refinishing. And even if I do say so myself, it's looking pretty good. Really quite happy with how it's turned out. I prioritised this section as it linked with some of the other high priority jobs that I had, such as refitting the instruments, and the wiring. My main aim after getting the car back from the car restorer was to get the engine running again. So I needed the instruments, ignition, wiring and all that sort of stuff fairly well advanced. I'm pretty happy with the finish achieved with 7 coats of high gloss polyurethane. As we look closer at the dash, you can see that it's divided up into sort of 2 main sections. There's the solid timber section you can see here, and a flat plywood section that you can see here. In this first batch of refinishing, I also worked on some solid timber trim at the edge of the glove box here on the driver's side. You can see there, I'll just go a little closer. It's looking very nice. And there's also another little bit on the other side of the steering column down here. And as we move over to the passenger side, there's a curved piece of timber trim around the glove box and a flat piece of timber trim at the front of the tool tray. I really like the colour of the Rover timber trim as it is, so the only staining I've done is to the plywood sections in order to colour match that section with the solid timber trim. Go through how I went about refinishing and staining in reasonable detail as I cover the refinishing process for the remaining interior trim. But before I do that, I'll just move over to this corner where you can see some evidence of the repair that was done there, where it had some wood rot, but it's certainly looking a whole lot better than it was. As I mentioned, I'm pretty happy with the end result here, but probably would have done some things a little differently if I were to do it again. The plywood section is quite open grain timber, and I wonder if I could achieve a slightly better result if I'd used a sanding sealer. Anyway, it's certainly good enough, and I won't be taking it out anytime soon to see if I can improve it. Before moving on, I'd like to tell what I think is an incredible good luck story that revolves around this little bit of curved timber trim here at the front of the passenger side glove box. When I bought this car as a restoration project, this piece of trim was missing altogether. Well, here's the story of my missing timber trim, and I thought the best place to tell the story was sitting here in the car, because it sort of places the story in context, I think. Now, this story really dates back to the quite early history of this restoration project, where I've been working on getting the engine running. When I bought the car, the engine had not run for about 28 years. I was told the car had been a daily runner before that. So I was keen to get the engine running, really just to ascertain what sort of condition the engine was in, with a view to determining whether I'd need to take the engine out for reconditioning or not. So I focused on what I would refer to as the peripheral systems around the engine, things like the cooling system, the fuel system, the ignition system, so that I could get the engine running. I was pretty happy with the progress that I was making and sort of wanted to share that. So I posted a few photos on a Facebook group called the Rover P3 Facebook group, which has subsequently evolved into the Rover P3 and All Running Boards Rovers group. So if you're not aware of this group, I strongly recommend you check it out. If you're restoring an older Rover, it's a really handy group to be part of. You can post some photos of your car on there. But perhaps more importantly, if you have any restoration questions, you can post your questions to the group, and in effect, you get access to the combined wisdom or otherwise of all the group members worldwide. So I've certainly found that to be a really helpful thing. So anyway, back to the story. I posted some photos on this group, and then another member from the group who lived only about 40 minutes drive from where I live contacted me. His name was Adrian, and he mentioned that he also had a 1949 P3 Rover, the same body style as mine, the 4-light version, and also the same colour as mine even. And Adrian asked if I'd like to come out and see his car one weekend, so which I very enthusiastically replied I sure would. So I head out there and enjoy a pleasant afternoon with Adrian over a cup of tea, talking about our restoration projects. And in the course of the conversation, I mentioned some of the challenges that I've had with my P3 Rover Restoration, including the missing parts. I mentioned, for example, that I had a bracket missing that supports the fog light at the front of the car. Adrian happened to have a spare one, which he was happy to give to me. So thank you, Adrian. That's really very much appreciated. Now that I've had that bracket powder coated, it looks like this. I also mentioned that I was missing part of the Rover toolkit, the jack, which is a fairly big part of the Rover toolkit. Adrian again had a spare one, which he was happy to give to me, so thank you again. Actually, in this case, it wasn't the exact jack that you would find in a P3 Rover, but rather it was a jack of the same brand, Beverlift, and very similar style. I think the jack that Adrian gave me would have come out of another British car of the same era. So that jack looks like this now. I'm pretty confident that I'll be able to modify the jack and get it to P3 Rover specifications. So very lucky to have found that. And then the conversation continued, and I mentioned the missing timber trim. Now, to be honest, this is probably the biggest headache for me. The other bits, I was fairly confident that I'd either be able to find them or figure out a way of manufacturing them myself. I mean, for example, that bracket that supports the fog lamp, I could have fabricated one of those if I had to. I mean, I'm glad I don't have to. But the missing timber trim was a different story. I wasn't at all confident how I could replace that. and I really didn't fancy my chances of finding one anywhere. So I mentioned this missing piece of timber trim to Adrian, and then to my surprise he mentioned that he'd salvaged some timber trim, automotive timber trim, from his local dump. I think he said the Malalar dump. So the Malalar region is about 58 kilometres north of Adelaide, and it's an area just best known for growing crops. I think there's also a car racing track out there where they occasionally do some historic vehicle racing. Anyway, he salvaged this timber trim, and he went away and came back with a cardboard box full of timber trim, most of it looking pretty well weathered, like it had been on the dump for a while. And he rummaged around in this box and then pulled out a curved piece of timber trim, and then walked over to his P3 and compared it to the piece of timber trim that was missing from my car. And sure enough, he is holding the exact piece of timber trim that I was after. I just could not believe my luck at this point. And again, he was happy to give it to me. I mean, seriously, what are the chances of finding this piece of timber trim on a car that was 68 years old back then? A car that had never been produced in really significant quantities. I mean, there were less than 10,000 P3 Rovers produced all those years ago. And then for it to be found on a dump 58 kilometres north of Adelaide, and then for me to be lucky enough to bump into the guy who found it, and then for him to be generous enough to give it to me. Yep, a very good luck story. So this is a timber trim after I'd sanded it back and done some repair work on it. I salvaged a small section of wood from some spare trim that I had to make this repair. Now, in addition to the dashboard timber trim, the P3 Rover also has some very nice timber trim around each of the windows and also around the sunroof, as you can see here. Now I'll give quite a detailed description of the refinishing process that I followed with the timber around the windows and also around the sunroof. And really this is the same process I followed with the dashboard as well. Now the first step involved removing the soft trim that's attached to the timber trim and the steel brackets. So on the back surface of all the parts I marked things according to my own code system. So PSR, for example, stands for passenger side rear. So after marking all the parts, the next step was to begin the scraping process. I prefer to use a scraper rather than a paint stripper, but that's really just my personal preference. I've used a tungsten carbide bladed scraper, scraping in the direction of the wood grain, never across it. Now the trick is just to use just enough pressure to scrape the finish off. What you don't want to do is wood carving. After scraping, I sanded it with some 120 grit garnet paper just to get the last remaining little bits of old finish off. You do need to get as much of the old finish off as you can with the scraping, because the finish will tend to clog the garnet paper up a fair bit. Well, it was lots of work, but we finally have bare timber. Now when I stain the reproduction plywood section of the dash, I did some experimenting with different stains on the back side of the dash, and to some extent what I've done is sort of reproduce that experiment here. So I did some experimenting to figure out what combination of stains I'd need to match the solid timber sections. So what I found worked well was several coats of Old Baltic, probably about 3 coats of Old Baltic, followed by a coat of the maple. The maple just gave it that little bit of orangey redness, which sort of perfected the match fairly well, I think. So I used this Feast Watson proof tint, which is a spirit-based tint. I think the spirit being methylated spirits. I had a fairly good collection of these stains from some furniture restoration projects that I've done over the years, and I added to my collection a little more in order to just really have a good range of stains to play with to get this colour match to work well. The flickering is due to me thinking that the higher the frame rate setting on the camera, the better, but it turns out you need to consider things like the frequency of your power supply, as in how many hertz your power supply is delivered in. Anyway, it's a long story and I'm not sure I could explain it all that well. And here's the timber after the first coat of polyurethane. So the product I've decided to use for the refinishing is this Feast Watson Spa Marine varnish that I've got here. The reason I've chose this is one, I was fairly familiar with this range of product. I've used it in furniture restoration projects before, or actually not the Spa Marine varnish, but other products from within this range. And I was always quite happy with the quality of the product and the ease of use. The reason I've chosen the Spa Marine varnish is because it's more UV resistant than many polyurethane finishes, although that's not necessarily saying very much because polyurethane finishes as a general rule aren't particularly UV resistant. So this is what the remaining timber trim looks like after 6 coats of polyurethane. I'm thinking I'll do just one last coat now, but very happy with how it's coming up. One thing I've noticed is I think that as I put on more coats, the colour match on this stain plywood section actually seems to get closer to the colour of the solid timber. So very happy with that. These photos were taken after 7 coats of polyurethane finish, so this is the finished product really. The only thing left to sort out now is the soft trim that goes around the wooden trim. I think I'll cut new bits of ply for these green trim parts and then have those recovered. Well, hi again. With this I'll wrap up chapter 19 of my 1949 P3 Rover Restoration story. I hope you found the chapter interesting and informative, and like most parts of this restoration story, it ended up being more complicated and time consuming than I expected to refinish the timber. However, I'm happy with the results and certainly looking forward to getting all the timber trim back in the car. For the next chapter, I'm thinking I'll cover the fitting of a new wiring loom and the general rewiring of the car, which will include wiring some indicators that the car didn't have originally. I'm largely finished with doing the actual work. I've just got a little bit more work to do on the actual video. So I hope to see you at the next video, and bye for now.